facing antitrust pressure, could Google opt to break itself up?
You have to ask yourself, does that really satisfy the regulators, right?
Soldiers are now being told they have to use Facebook while on the battlefield.
Palmer Luckey, who is the CEO and founder of Anduril, was the founder and CEO of Oculus.
Donald Trump has perhaps inadvertently done the EU a favor and they can no longer rely on the US.
It might be better and easier and faster to register a company, but then you run into the deep and dense regulatory framework of Europe.
Silicon Valley, even at its worst, is a place where the most talented tech founders want to go. But if you're not Silicon Valley, it's a different game that you're playing.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is a Reacts episode.
Hi, I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
And I'm Chris Saad.
And in today's episode of the Startup Podcast Reacts, should Google chop itself up into parts? Why is Meta getting in bed with the US military? The rise or the resurrection of Europe, finally, and why New York City is becoming one of the hottest startup cities on earth. Can't wait to get into it, Chris. Let's bust in. So the first thing we wanted to talk about today is I thought there was a really interesting idea, an interesting story in the New York Times that the title was, Facing Antitrust Pressure, Could Google Opt to Break Itself Up? Really what it was saying is that if you look at Alphabet or Google, right, which includes things like Google Search, YouTube, Waymo, all sorts of other of these like billion-dollar plus companies, Google Ads and so on, and, they're facing very real antitrust scrutiny to be broken up. Could they, and perhaps should they, actually preempt the whole thing and break themselves up, and by doing so, actually increase their overall value, right? Because there is an argument that Google is currently paying what's sometimes called the conglomerate tax, which is when investors look at a company that has a bunch of different big businesses attached to itself, that people actually kind of value it lower because they're like, this is too confusing. I'll take the part of the business that's easiest to understand and then value the whole thing that way. And so something like YouTube is probably being undervalued. Something like Waymo is probably being undervalued. If you actually look at the way analysts value Google, they pretty much look at the core search and ads business and somewhat discount the rest. So Google could actually do its shareholders a real solid by just spinning themselves off, and then they would also lose all that distraction of having to deal with the antitrust scrutiny. Honestly, Chris, I think this could be pretty smart because Google, unlike a lot of other companies that face some of this antitrust scrutiny, do have some pretty clear points where they could break themselves up, right? They have these quite separable business units. I've mentioned YouTube, Waymo, core Google Search. You can also think about Chrome and think about Android. All of these are companies where I'd look at them and be like, I'd like to buy shares in that thing. And yes, they will lose their advantage of being able to kind of share a bunch of resources and share a bunch of information and preference each other along the way. But the truth is that is exactly why they're being investigated for antitrust. And we've talked about this on previous episodes, Chris. The Department of Justice has a very strong case that Google is abusing its monopoly. And so if we see what happened to Microsoft back in the 90s, they spent so long fighting the Department of Justice and making accommodations and so on that they really took their eye off the ball. It created a culture of nearly fear or wariness internally, where instead of thinking what's right for the user, they had to think what will not attract the ire of the DOJ. And, we saw the result between that and Steve Ballmer's leadership. Microsoft had probably 20 years in the wilderness before they finally made a comeback under Satya Nadella. And so if Google is going to face this stuff, and if they have all of these viable business units, which they do, that they can spin off, then it seems to me that they could avoid a lot of headaches, do the right thing for their shareholders, which ultimately is their fiduciary duty to split these things up. And then each of these companies don't have to worry about antitrust. They can compete in the most vicious way they can think of in the true capitalist tradition, right? The Google ad network will just completely take on their competitors. Google Search can make any deal they want, try to get all the distribution they can, leveraging their brand. I think it's pretty smart.
Yeah, you're right. So, we've talked about this example a few times, but the Microsoft antitrust lawsuits of the 90s really hobbled that company, right? And at the exact wrong moment, the moment around when they were trying to adapt to the internet and adapt to mobile. And as you said, it left Microsoft really out in the wilderness for an entire cycle or two. The interesting thing about Google is that they've long recognized that they are a holding company which contains many very valuable individual companies. That's why they renamed themselves to Alphabet. Alphabet is ostensibly this larger meta company, pun intended, that holds many sub-businesses, the same way then Facebook renamed itself to Meta, which holds a number of sub-businesses and apps. And so if you think about Google has already oriented themselves to being a holding company, then you might argue, well, that could work really well. And they're already kind of designed that way. Maybe with some shared infrastructure that they've exposed as GCP, many of these businesses could be spun out while still using the Google architecture or infrastructure underneath the same way everybody else does on the public GCP cloud. But on the other hand, you have to ask yourself, does that really satisfy the regulators, right? The regulators are worried about this kind of cross-selling between their core assets. And some of those core assets really need to live together to survive and thrive, potentially. Search is really quite dependent on the ad network. Search is dependent on Android and Chrome to some degree to drive distribution, to protect its distribution. And Workspace, I think, is also it leverages a lot of the core tech of Google that may not necessarily be surfaced through GCP. So, yeah, they can try, but they'll be hard pressed. They'll have a hard time breaking apart the parts that are intertwined, which are probably the parts that are at the front and center focus of the regulator. So they might end up breaking a bunch of stuff up, but not the stuff the regulator wants them to break up.
Yeah, well, no, they would need to break up the stuff the regulator wants them to break up. And when you say something like Google search is dependent on Chrome for its distribution and so on, that's exactly what the Justice Department is worried about, of course. But also, is it really true? The way I'd see it working is at the moment, Google has this deal with Apple, right? They pay an insane amount of money. Is it $20 billion, maybe more, every year to Apple to have Google search distributed on the iPhone? And you know what? That's great for business. So you could imagine that Chrome Inc. would put up their distribution to the highest bidder, and Google Search Inc. could, of course, bid for that. And thanks to the wonders of markets and the limited but extremely powerful efficiency of capitalism, we would end up with a deal that is really good for both of them and generates more value in the system, but also allows other players. Why is the Department of Justice interested? Because no one else gets a look in, right? Because of these synergies. It gives other people the opportunity to bid as well.
Yeah, it's fair enough. I mean, a controlled breakup is better than a forced one.
Exactly.
If they can set it up with using some of that core infrastructure through GCP and cutting some commercial deals that are open to the rest of the world, could be a good idea. I think you're right, though. It reminds me of sort of like a bad breakup, a bad divorce. Sometimes one of the parties is like holding on for dear life and almost being punitive and trying to hurt the other person during the divorce. And then you're just hurting yourself. You're just hurting the kids, you're hurting yourself. You spend days, weeks, months, years in acrimonious lawyers, whatever. It's just like, give them half your shit and move on. It's just easier and better and cheaper and faster, and you can, focus on the next part of your life. And I think this is possibly a strategy that Google could use for themselves. I like it. It's good.
Exactly.
All right, that's our take on how Google might want to break themselves up before being broken up by the government. What do you guys think? Jump down in the comments and let us know your thoughts.
Okay, so this one's a little bit crazy. Soldiers are now being told they have to use Facebook while on the battlefield. What?
Almost exactly like that. That's a good way of characterizing this story, Yaniv.
Anduril, the military tech startup, and Meta teaming up to use XR for the American military. So XR is mixed reality or augmented reality, right? This idea of like you wear the glasses, you see the real world around you, and you get a whole bunch of information over the top. So kind of Terminator style. And this is basically an announcement that Meta, the parent company of Facebook, are working very closely with Anduril and the US military to integrate their XR technology, which of course has been developed with consumer purposes in mind, to enhance situational awareness for warfighters and other platforms. So I just think this is sort of an interesting watershed moment.
Look, I really like Anduril a lot. I think there's a number of philosophical things that they've done that I think are overdue in Silicon Valley. Number one, they're building a product-led military company. All the other military contractors are exactly that. They're technology-backed services companies, the vaunted technology-backed service company that we always talk about in the show, in the EDU episodes. That's what most military contractors are. They kind of take requirements from the government or the RFPs or whatever, and they go and build custom products for them, and it's a goddamn nightmare, and it's expensive as hell. And so Anduril has taken the opposite approach, the Silicon Valley approach, to say, we're going to have a roadmap of stuff we want to build. We'll take insights and information from our customers in the market, but we're going to go build what we want to build, and we'll build product lines, and we'll scale them up and make them really cost efficient and so on. I think that's amazing. And the other thing Anduril is doing is saying, hey, why is Silicon Valley afraid of working with the government and working with the military, just philosophically? Why are we as Silicon Valley not bolstering the country that we live in and believe in and its values? Now, you can argue about its values and you can argue about its wars, but
Especially right now.
especially right now. But, the principle of, hey, we should defend the country and values we believe in, whatever you believe, seems relatively like the right approach. What's interesting about this story in particular about Anduril and Meta teaming up around XR, around VR and AR, is Palmer Luckey, who is the CEO and founder of Anduril, was the founder and CEO of Oculus Rift, right? The original group that got acquired by Meta to make the goggles, the glasses. And then Palmer got fired by Mark Zuckerberg for, I think, donating to the Republican Party or some crazy shit. It was just some, really ridiculous thing in the middle of cancel culture. And so Palmer left Meta, or was rather ejected from Meta, to create Anduril. So the idea that they would then partner up again around mixed reality is a kind of like a bittersweet irony, I'm sure, for both of them. But yes, taking consumer-style, product-led thinking and applying it to the military, both in the pure military tech that Anduril is developing and in the AR, VR, XR stuff that Meta's developing, I think makes a ton of sense from a product level, a business level, and a military level.
I think that's really interesting. Here's another really interesting thing for me, Chris, which is that if you actually look at what's happening here, is it's called technology transfer. And technology transfer is something that has happened for decades, but it's nearly always been in the other direction, right? One of the arguments for military spending for things like the space program is that the research and the technological development that happens as part of, for example, creating a new fighter jet tends to trickle down into civilian uses and has this massive multiplier effect on the value. Like, not only are we defending the country and whatnot, but we're actually giving our technology industry a boost. What we're starting to see, which I just think is so fascinating, and by the way, Silicon Valley has been a huge beneficiary of that technology transfer. I mean, the internet was created by the US military, for God's sake, right? Like, Silicon Valley has ridden off the back of US military innovation for decades. And what's fascinating is now we're seeing this sort of the tide turn, and we're having technology transfer from these civilian consumer products back into the military. And I think, Anduril was already following that thesis. If you look at AI, sure, some of the fundamental foundational research into AI was funded by DARPA, the US military funding agency. But the truth is, all the really fascinating work on AI has been happening in the civilian sector, right? From companies like DeepMind and OpenAI. And now the military is seeing the massive use of it and the strategic value, the geopolitical value. Of course, look at NVIDIA, right? A company that was founded to make chips for computer games, for God's sake, is now probably geopolitically the most important company in the world. So I don't know, Chris, I think it's just an observation, but I just think whether it likes it or not, Silicon Valley and the tech sector are being pulled into geopolitics and into how we conceive of our military is just really fascinating.
Yeah, well, Jensen Huang would take issue with the way you characterized NVIDIA, I'm sure, because his whole argument is, we're always the acceleration company. We just found our first product market fit in video games. But I think that's a little bit of retrofitting the narrative there. You're right. This is an incredible, interesting, exciting kind of back and forth feedback loop between the two. It's about time that there was more reverse flow back into the Department of Defense. Just as a fun aside, friend of the pod, Emil Michael, is now the head of DoD R&D budget, I think. He's kind of in charge of finding and investing and buying these next-gen technologies. So I'm sure Emil is somewhere in the mix there, and when he eventually exits the administration and is able to join us again, he may give us some non-top secret inside baseball on what's happened with all of that.
Also maybe worth mentioning in the context of recent news has been this amazing strike by Ukraine on the Russian strategic bomber fleet, where they basically had this long covert operation to smuggle drones deep into Russian territory, and then on their command, all of these drones just hovered up out of these hiding places and destroyed, I believe it was $12 billion worth of Russian military hardware. And again, the drone industry is another example of where really most of the tech transfer has happened from consumer tech back into the military. And a lot of that's happening in Ukraine. I heard the point that probably Ukraine, once this awful war is over, is probably going to be incredibly well positioned as a military contracting superpower. So, they're doing really amazing stuff there. And no casualties, civilian or military. So this is a sort of military victory you can celebrate with a very clear conscience.
Yeah, and a little bit of political inside baseball there. I heard that they did not give the US any heads up, which tells you a
Yeah.
lot about the relationship and the trust levels of the international community. All right, those are our thoughts on using VR, AR, Palmer Luckey, and Anduril in the battlefield. Let us know what you think down in the comments.
All right, Chris, you know Europe, that whipping boy that everyone makes fun of for being stuck in the old world? Well, they're about to make a comeback. Let's talk about how. The first thing that caught my eye is a report out of the UK, which is that the UK government has had a trial with 20,000 of their officials using Microsoft Copilot AI. As a side, Copilot AI is pretty shit, so we'll come back to that. And they saved 26 minutes daily, which comes to 2 weeks a year off of their workload, right? And so this is part of a government efficiency drive. We're talking about, the efficiency of public servants. The US had Doge. The UK is taking, in my opinion, a much more sensible approach and trialing things like AI to improve productivity and reduce costs of government. Now, 2 weeks a year, that is an over 5% increase in productivity. That may or may not sound like a lot to you, but Chris, this is actually huge, right? To get a 5% increase in productivity, there has been no single technology that has come close to doing that, I would say, since the rise of the internet. And this is just, again, this is why I mentioned that Copilot AI is shit, because they achieved this remarkable feat using a really substandard AI product. So this is actually, to me, is kind of a lower bound on the kind of productivity improvements even kind of crusty old government entities can get if they actually embrace AI in just some simple ways to improve their productivity.
Yeah, well, breaking news. Doge was dumb. Next up, water is wet and the Pope is Catholic. There's 100 ways of doing government efficiency that are better than Doge, or actually effective, unlike Doge. From actually looking at the org, actually looking at roles, actually looking at performance reviews, actually looking at what the role of government is, actually looking at the programs and ranking them by performance, and maybe adding some AI into the mix. And so, yeah, look, it's unsurprising that Europe is getting some efficiencies in a way that is more elegant than Doge. B, it's unsurprising that that is powered by AI. And C, it's unsurprising that the US can't seem to find their ass with two hands and a flashlight when it comes to government efficiency and effectiveness. Their departments are the definition of broken, from healthcare, health insurance to the DMV. And it's in many ways, this is basically just a function of corruption. Everything in the US is corrupted by money. Lobbyists and lawyers, and they break everything on purpose on the way through the door. So there's a lot to be said about European bureaucracy and over-regulation and over-engineering and over kind of social engineering their culture. But there's also a lot to be said about the US doing a lot of under-engineering and ineffective execution of their government and their culture. So,
but I want to make this a story about AI, really, Chris, as well. Like this is. I think it can be overstated how sclerotic Europe is. I don't think it's anywhere near as bad as the news media often likes to report. And I think this is just a good example of how an organization that is genuinely interested in improving its productivity using AI, even a large bureaucratic organization, can realize really meaningful results here. And just as someone who's sort of thinking about AI and the impact it's going to have on the workforce in the future, on society in the future, I feel like this is, it's easy to be on the cutting edge in tech talking about, the 3-person unicorn and so on. But this is right down the other end, which is a bunch of civil servants in Whitehall in the UK can save 2 weeks a year just by using a third-rate AI copilot. That's pretty amazing.
My favorite part of the way you're framing the story is by continuously calling out Copilot as a piece of shit. It's true, but it's funny.
That's what I like to do.
2 weeks is just the beginning, right?
Exactly. That is the point.
Yeah. Look, I think you're right. Government is the poster child for slow to adopt, and 2 weeks is probably the very bare minimum they'll be able to achieve. And it's an interesting story on both those dimensions, that even a slow bureaucratic process in Europe can do this. And it's just the beginning. It's just the beginning of their adoption and their measurement of the adoption. So yeah, it'll be good to see what happens next.
Now, the other story, which I feel is thematically related, Chris, comes from the Wall Street Journal, and it talks about how Europe has announced a bunch of programs where they're finally trying to trim their bureaucracy and get serious about startups. Basically, the main part of the announcement, and this is EU-wide, is new laws that will allow you to launch a company, so register a company and start trading in under 48 hours. So previously, Europe had a web of country-specific rules as well as EU-specific rules, and just a lot of difficulty in registering a company, getting a bank account, all of this basic stuff that founders don't want to have to think about, but they were slowed down by it. And the EU said, actually, we care about startups. We care about having a thriving economy of new businesses. And so we're taking this seriously and just scrubbing away all of this red tape and making it super easy to get started in Europe.
Yeah, this is great, of course. It's always better to make it easier to start a company and so on. What I struggle with is these things tend to happen in a little bit of a vacuum. And I always, get a bit frustrated that they don't happen in a more holistic way. So, for example, for some group, blue ribbon committee or whatever, to go and ask the question, how do we make startup innovation more successful in Europe? And come up with like a 17-stage funnel analysis of like, it's hard to start a company, it's hard to create a bank account, it's hard to get certificates for 20 different industries, it's hard to get this kind of approval, that kind of approval, our regulatory framework is a nightmare. Now let's work through each one by one. What tends to happen instead is like, oh, we just made it easier to register a company. Great. Now for that company to go get a financial services license or to go do crypto, to go do anything, you're going to quickly run into the exhausting, highly regulated environment in Europe, and you're going to be just as stuck as you were before you registered that company. And so if this is done as the first step of 1,700 other steps, and it's this iterative, agile process of untethering the startup ecosystem, fantastic. If this is kind of a point in time, one-off thing, it's sort of like going to be ultimately a bit incremental.
Yeah, it's incremental, but it's still fantastic. I feel like you don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. And yes, maybe there's more to come, but just making it simple to register a business, that's already a big win. I feel like this is more, I guess I'm trying to group these things thematically a bit, Chris. And, we're trying to talk less politics on this show, but I think the interesting thing here is, and this to me is another sign of Europe looking at the US and realizing they can no longer rely on the US and kind of waking from their slumber. And so, this goes along with, the UK improving government efficiency. This goes along with Ukraine being a world leader in producing military drones, with Europe increasing its spending on the military. Donald Trump has perhaps inadvertently done the EU a favor by getting them to, for the first time really, act like a union and look at themselves and say, we have so much potential, so many natural advantages. We have become complacent. We've become a bit sclerotic. We're not taking advantage of those, but it's not that hard to fix if we actually put our minds to it. And so let's start fixing it. And I think this is really cool.
It might be better and easier and faster to register a company, but then you run into the deep and dense regulatory framework of Europe. So, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So we'll see what happens.
Another thing that caught our eye this week is that New York City seems to be quietly winning the post-Silicon Valley tech war. So there are now over 25,000 tech startups in New York. That's up over 33% since the pandemic. So, it's something that I've noticed as well. There are more and more startups coming out of New York. We've got big tech that, Google is huge in New York and Amazon. And so we're kind of seeing the fact that New York is traditional strengths in finance, in media, in fashion, and now combining with it just being a great place for founders to go is really making it a powerful player. And of course, Silicon Valley is still far and away the leader, but New York is really becoming a very meaningful second force in US tech.
Yeah, the sort of the cliche or the stereotypes are that, Silicon Valley is fantastic for platforms and ecosystems. LA is great for media companies, and New York is great for fintech and fashion companies. And that is, I think, evolving a little bit over time. But it's not surprising to me that New York is starting to play a stronger and stronger role in the overall tech ecosystem. As a city, just if you evaluate it objectively as a city, I think New York is probably head and shoulders better than San Francisco. It has incredible culture, incredible, Broadway, incredible restaurants, incredible everything is happening in New York. And because of that density, people after COVID sort of thought to themselves, well, do I want to live in the city or do I want to live in a neighborhood where it's cheaper and there's more nature? And those who chose nature left San Francisco or left the city. And those who chose cities wanted to go to the best city they could find. And many of them went to New York. And so it really did erode, undermine many other cities in the country. And San Francisco has had the hardest time bouncing back, even with a lot of the AI influx. And so it's unsurprising to me, Macy's just shut down, Bloomingdale's just shut down, the Market on Market in the old Twitter building is shut down. Anyway, it still feels like San Francisco is going backwards, while New York has recovered a number of years ago. And so, yeah, this is unsurprising to me. Now, I don't want to, poo-poo San Francisco. I love San Francisco. Mission Rock is really on the up and up. The marina and North Beach and all this. They're beautiful, warm, amazing California lifestyle. You can drive down the one and get to the beaches. Napa and so on. But it's not, if you want to live in a city, New York is still the best city in the country and one of the best cities in the world. And I think it's playing to its strengths.
Okay, so you're connecting two important points here, Chris. And really what it comes down to is that Silicon Valley is unique and you don't want to compare yourselves to them. San Francisco can be a kind of limping, unpleasant place in a lot of ways, full of homeless people and a drug problem. And yet Silicon Valley as a place for tech is thriving like nowhere else. Silicon Valley, even at its worst, is a place where the most talented tech founders want to go. But if you're not Silicon Valley, it's a different game that you're playing. You have to be an attractive place to live. And New York is one of the most attractive places to live in the whole world. So it doesn't surprise me how well they're doing.
All right, those are our thoughts on San Francisco versus New York and the resurrection of New York as one of the best tech hubs in the world. Now we want to know what you think. So join us in the comments below. That's the pod. Yaniv, how can people find you on the internet?
So I am mostly on LinkedIn, trying to make it a less boring place. And I love getting connection requests from TSP listeners. I've actually had half a dozen in the last couple of days or so. I've accepted all of them. So if you let me know that you come from TSP, I will happily accept your request. Hope to see you there. How about you, Chris?
You can find me on LinkedIn as well. Give me a follow there. Let me know you're from the show. I've also been getting some connection requests, and you're right, Yaniv, that's a lot of fun. So let me know you're from the show, and I'll chat to you there. Otherwise, you can follow my newsletter over at chrissaad.com/newsletter. All right, Yaniv, catch you in the next one.
All right, see you, mate.